primarily in Ukraine and also those in Russia. Also, and Allison mentioned the coffee chats, which I've enjoyed attending and discussing with members quite a lot. I have to offer a mea culpa, certainly, because the last chat that we had a couple of months ago, I suggested that an invasion of Ukraine by Russia was extremely unlikely, and that Putin was probably playing hardball to extract concessions from the US. This was, of course, completely wrong. I guess I would say that many people, including myself and even more serious professional Russia watchers, academics, political scientists, really could never have imagined that what we're seeing right now, which is witnessing Russian rockets falling on Kiev and Kharkiv, and as we speak in the next couple of hours, an aerial bombardment on Kiev is expected from the Russian military. So we certainly got it wrong. I think Allison used the word a couple of times, unimaginable. And I think that really captures where we are. So that being said, some people did get it right, including the often maligned US intelligence community and many other military watchers and certain political scientists. So I think those people deserve a tremendous amount of credit for seeing this and warning that this was coming. And for the rest of us who kind of believed in the rationality of Vladimir Putin, we were caught very wrong-handed. But everything, of course, has changed and really changed on Monday. So in getting to the question of the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine, I'll try to keep my comments brief since there's quite a lot to say on this topic. I also understand that this is a very sensitive subject, and I will try to choose my words carefully to avoid offending or upsetting anyone that has very strongly held views on this topic. Again, I work in finance, primarily focused on the Central Asia region, so I'm not strictly a Russian politics expert by profession, but I am a trained historian, so I can give some comments on that. The idea that Ukraine is not a real country is certainly not an idea that was created by Vladimir Putin. It actually has deep historical roots. For much of the period of the Russian Empire, imperial rulers, the czars in Moscow, believed that the three main Slavic nationalities were really just branches of the one nationality, which was Russian. So this was divided into the quote unquote Great Russians, which are today modern day Russians, Little Russians, which are today modern day Ukrainians, and White Russians, which are Belarusians. So in the imperial mindset, these were all kind of offshoots of one kind of same brotherly family, which is why you hear this rhetoric coming from the Kremlin and Russian propagandists a lot that we're brothers. How can this be happening? During the periods throughout the Russian Empire, there are several periods of Russification, particularly in the 19th century under Nicholas I and Alexander III. And it was during this time that the growing Ukrainian national consciousness, which really emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries and fueled by such national writers as Taras Shevchenko, it came to be seen as the primary threat to the multi-ethnic stability of the Russian Empire. And accordingly, the Ukrainian language was suppressed in schools and government offices, and Ukrainian intellectuals were repressed. I should also note there's kind of a distinction in the Russian language that exists that does not carry over into English, which is that there's actually two words that mean Russian. In Russian, there's the word Ruski, which means ethnically Russian. We consider people from Russia ethnically Russian, and Rossiyski, which means the subject of the Russian Empire or the subject of Russian authority. So a person from Ukraine or Uzbekistan living in the Russian Empire could be both Uzbek and Russian at the same time, but they would be Rossiyski, a Russian subject. So this distinction doesn't exist in English and adds to quite a lot of confusion about the two. So in Putin's extremely dark speech on Monday about the recognition of the Donbass separatist republics, which I had the displeasure of watching live, he really focused in on the Bolsheviks, and in particular Vladimir Lenin's responsibility for creating an artificial Ukrainian state and national identity. There is a bit of truth to this in the sense that the Bolsheviks during the revolution in the early years of the Soviet Union were opposed to the Russian Empire's what they called Great Russian Chauvinism. And as part of their anti-imperialist project, they sought to develop national identity among the constituent parts of the early Soviet Union through a process in Russian known as korenizatsiya. It doesn't really translate well into English, but I guess the closest word would be indigenization. And this involved promoting the national language, promoting national members into points of government. So the Ukrainian subsection of the USSR would be headed by Ukrainians. and something like this. So this policy was ultimately ended under Stalin pretty quickly. But this also gets the reason why laying the blame for the creation of this artificial, quote unquote, Ukrainian state also laid the blame. They also laid the foundations for what would become the modern country of Ukraine through different administrative reforms and creating the territorial boundaries of Ukraine as it exists today. And Putin accused the Bolsheviks of, quote, gifting traditionally Russian heartlands in eastern Ukraine and in southern Ukraine, an area that he referred to as Novorossiya, or New Russia, that he had gifted this to them, and that they had not shown appreciation sufficiently, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, for this gift. But of course, Ukraine was not a creation of the Bolsheviks, and long before Vladimir Lenin showed up on the scene, Ukraine has possessed a rich cultural, linguistic, and political identity. During the Russian Civil War, a Ukrainian state existed and fought multiple sides: Bolsheviks, Germans, whites, everyone, from 1917 to 1921, before the Bolsheviks ultimately triumphed. For Putin, particularly, there was insult added to injury when Nikita Khrushchev transferred the administrative region of Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1954. Crimea used to be part of the Russian subdivision of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev transferred it both for administrative and historical purposes, given that 1954 was the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav, which is where the Cossacks living in what is modern-day Ukraine pledged their loyalty and allegiance to the Tsar of the Russian Empire. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the breakup of the territories along the lines of the Soviet republics, these administrative subdivisions, left many hardline conservatives and nationalists in Russia believing that they had lost something that had rightfully belonged to them. So to wrap up, I would say that it's often repeated in Western media that Vladimir Putin is seeking to recreate the Soviet Union after its collapse in 1991. However, I would say from his speech on Monday and his remarks last night when he effectively declared war on Ukraine, and also his pseudo-historical article that he published on Ukrainian and Russian relations in the summer of 2021, that he's really seeking more to recreate the Slavic and Orthodox elements of the Russian Empire, not the Soviet Union. Putin called modern-day Ukraine Lenin's Ukraine and vowed to impose, quote, real decommunization implicitly by force on Ukraine. Putin appears to be a true believer in the power, above all else, of the Russian state. The Russian state is a concept that has developed over centuries to explain how Russia has evolved, consolidated, and expanded as the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union in the face of surrounding enemies and conquerors. In this belief, the Russian state has existed unbroken since the founding of Kievan Rus by Rurik the Varangian in 882 AD, and Putin sees himself as its heir and its protector. He believes, I think clearly from what he says, that he is acting to protect the viability and power of the Russian state against outside enemies. This is a messianic mission that has been shared by leaders from Peter the Great to Joseph Stalin. And of course, unfortunately, Putin's conception of the Russian state includes the lands of modern-day Ukraine and also Belarus, who is aided and assisted Russia's invasion and is complicit in these crimes. For centuries, Russian historians have elaborated on this concept of the, quote, gathering of the Russian lands, where czars and general secretaries of the Communist Party conquered and reabsorbed territories that they believe belonged to the Russian state. And I fear that we're now witnessing the latest chapter of this political evolution, although such cross-temporal comparisons are normally seen as an oversimplification by historians, but I think in this case they are appropriate.
So that's very good. Thank you for that. So for many years, the government in Ukraine was very friendly to the Russian government, and there seemed to be, you know, they worked together not just during the Soviet Union, but for many years thereafter. And then in February of 2014, protesters were able to overthrow the government of President Viktor Yanukovych, who was friendly to Russia. And during that revolution, which was what they call the Euromaidan protests, it was after that, shortly after that, that Vladimir Putin went into Crimea, and the two breakaway republics left Ukraine as well, or tried to leave. So my question is sort of, why is he, after that, there was a little bit of a period of calm. Why is he being so aggressive now? What is going on now that made him decide this was the appropriate time to move to take over the rest of Ukraine?
Thank you. That's a great question, and one that's extremely difficult to answer with any kind of precision. So, again, I'll preface this by saying this is very much kind of my own opinion, but also kind of widely shared opinion, I guess, of many analysts. But there are, in terms of why he decided to act exactly now, there are a lot of rumors, particularly on the Russian language media, but also in English too, that Putin could possibly be suffering from a terminal illness or another debilitating condition like Parkinson's. There also have been some serious reports, including leaks from conversations between Putin and President Emmanuel Macron of France, that Putin, in his complete isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic, became disconnected from reality in the world around him, which over time led him to, unfortunately for all of us, read up a lot on Russian history and to take an increasingly irrational and confrontational approach to Russia's security questions. I think you did a great job in kind of suggesting that this conflict really began in 2014. There were friendly relations between the state of Ukraine and Russia beforehand. Russia, as Putin mentioned in his speeches, provided a lot of economic resources, but also kind of exported the Soviet Russian system of corruption and authoritarianism to Ukraine as well. I think that placing the origins of this current conflict in 2014 is right. And after the Ukraine's Maidan revolution and the subsequent annexation of Crimea and Russian-sponsored separatist movement in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine is really the genesis of this. The Minsk II Accords, which were signed in February 2015 after the conflict kind of settled down a bit, were really seen at the time by almost all parties as a tenuous agreement that was politically impossible for Kiev to implement and divorced from reality, considering Russia's military and financial backing of the separatists in the east. A Ukraine that was hostile to Russia and making public overtures to joining NATO and the EU would always have been seen as unacceptable security threat to Moscow. And perhaps now, with hindsight, it was only a matter of time before events spilled over into outright invasion and war. Although I think there is some question about contingency in it, that this was really a foregone conclusion in the past. That being said, it's clear that the Russian financial and economic apparatus was instructed to prepare for further sanctions and isolations from Western markets after 2014, and they were well prepared for the invasion, that order that was given yesterday, and the subsequent sanctions that were announced by Joe Biden, the UK, and the EU on major Russian banks and the Russian financial system. In my opinion, I would place the origins of this current kind of hot phase of the conflict, particularly the escalation of tensions and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to the summer of 2020, when protests in Belarus over falsified elections nearly toppled the dictatorship of Alexander Lukashenko, Putin's long-term ally, a very mercurial figure. I think it's now clear that it's possible, if not likely, that the Russian security elite truly believed the US and NATO were behind the peaceful protests that were ruthlessly crushed. And Lukashenko survived thanks to Russia's support, which further bounded the countries closer together, and which has expressed itself now in both of them invading Ukraine. I think the idea of them truly believing this stuff is something that we maybe take for granted. A lot of people, myself included, would have considered these overtures to Western interference to be a kind of cynical ploy to crush domestic opposition and as a lever to rally around patriotism. But I think it's become clear that they actually believe this stuff, which makes it all the more dangerous and helps kind of explain where we are in the current situation of the conflict. And after the events in Belarus, the Putin regime began a really qualitative and quantitative escalation in its crackdown on domestic dissent. This is when we had the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny and the arrest of thousands of Russians for unsanctioned protests, and who received, some of them, very serious jail sentences. and a lot of commentators observed a shift in how the Putin regime at this time really disregarded any pretense of decorum or the appearance of allowing civil society to voice its concerns, something that was important, especially when Russia held the World Cup in 2018, which was seen as a kind of successful open preview with people having fun in the streets and no ruthless crackdown and beatings with batons. So I think that Putin, after he published this pseudo-historical article in 2020, really laid out the case that we're seeing right now. It's really a prelude to the events that have unfolded. And also, I think an important chapter is also the unrest in Kazakhstan last month, which was, not that that's the subject of today's discussion, but really a kind of internal conflict between the Kazakh elite, but it gave a dry run for Russia's airborne forces to capture an airport and establish order in defense of the government. So that's kind of how I see it.
Okay, excellent. Do you think there's any chance that if they're successful in Ukraine, the Russians will think about moving beyond Ukraine? Is it conceivable that they could eventually even threaten a NATO country like one of the Baltic states? I read a quote recently from Stephen Hadley, who was the National Security Advisor between 2005 and 2009. And he said, quote, "If Putin succeeds in Ukraine, he might decide that he needs a land bridge to link Kaliningrad to Belarus. And as such, a land bridge would have to go through either Lithuania or Poland. And that would mean a war between Russia and NATO." It sounds extreme to me, but do you think there's any chance of that? Would he take on NATO with its Article 5 guarantees?
Again, very difficult question to answer, and I'm certainly not a military expert nor an expert on NATO affairs. I
Just your
agree.
opinion.
Yeah. I agree that it sounds quite extreme, but then again, if you had asked me on Friday of last week, would it be extreme that Russia would launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I would have said the same thing. So I think that it appears to me at the current moment to be unlikely that Russia would move beyond the borders of Ukraine. I think a direct conflict with NATO members and the triggering of Article 5 for collective defense moves the conflict into a substantively different level, which involves nuclear weapons. Although, of course, Putin threatened implicitly the use of nuclear weapons with any state that, quote unquote, interfered in his actions in Ukraine right now. I think that the response will be key, the sanctions and also the buildup of NATO personnel that is likely to follow in the coming weeks and months in response. I think that, to me, the more likely outcome is that Europe faces the prospect of a new Iron Curtain with a militarized border between perhaps whatever rump state of Ukraine might exist after this, Belarus and Russia and the rest of Europe. Again, nothing can be ruled out, but I would also say that we were talking about the historical origins and the quote unquote gathering of the Russian lands. The Baltic countries have never been viewed in the same way as Ukraine and Belarus have been, a kind of conceptually a different territory for both the Russian Tsars, and we're not part of the Soviet Union until they were invaded in 1941 or 1939 by the Soviet Union in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I would also say, though, in terms of what's going to happen in Ukraine, that it seems to me that Russia's aim is to conquer all of Ukraine and to topple the Zelensky government and to install a puppet regime that will sign agreements with Russia that will recognize the annexation of Crimea and provide the Kremlin with indirect control over Ukrainian affairs through a kind of quasi-federal system of governance. At the very least, it seems clear that the Russian military is planning to conquer left bank Ukraine, which is the territory east of the Dnieper River, seizing major cities, although it does remain unclear how far they plan to push into Western Ukraine, which would then put them on the border directly with NATO.
One of the most prevalent explanations that I hear people saying for why Vladimir Putin would feel the need to do what he's doing now is that it's NATO's fault, that NATO expansion starting around 1999 and going into a number of countries in Eastern Europe made the Russians feel threatened, and that there had been a promise that NATO would not expand eastward and did not keep its promise, and that it's the West's fault for Russia feeling vulnerable enough to lash out this way. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, we hear this topic discussed quite a lot, and certainly have has been discussed quite a lot for the past 10 years. Before I address the kind of deeper question, I would say to be clear that there is only one party that is to blame for the invasion of Ukraine, and that is Vladimir Putin and his government. They failed to create even a quasi-legitimate casus belli or even a false flag incident that was rumored. And they didn't even use much preparation to convince Russia's civilian population of the necessity of war. They just went ahead and sent Russian tanks straight into Ukraine. So I don't think anyone shares the blame for these bloody events. The question of NATO and its expansion into Eastern Europe is an important one with a kind of fraught history. It has certainly radicalized Putin and the Russian security apparatus around him into believing that they face an existential threat from the Western alliance. You mentioned these kind of debates about the oral guarantees that were given to the Soviet Union during the reunification of Germany that NATO would not expand its presence eastward. These are quite rehashed quite a lot. And again, I'm not a specialist in this particular topic, but it does seem to me that some kind of assurances, either oral or implied in the spirit of negotiations of unifying Germany, were given to Soviet representatives that NATO wouldn't expand. But at the same time, of course, as NATO will often say, that it is the independent choice of countries to become members. And also during the 1990s, Boris Yeltsin never openly challenged the NATO expansion that took place during those years. So, but I would say that regardless of whether we in the US or Europe believe that NATO presents a threat to the Russian security, the Russian leadership, especially Vladimir Putin, believe that they face this existential threat. To use a kind of form of a vulgar historicism, the threat of encirclement and invasion from the West has occupied the minds of Russian leaders since the time of Ivan the Terrible, and invasions by Hitler and Napoleon, further cemented these fears. Now, Putin let his true feelings about NATO expansion be known already in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, when he was still kind of seen as a modernizing, if not liberal, and certainly not revanchist authoritarian leader. He described the bloc's enlargement as, quote, a serious provocation. And it also should be noted that, realistically, before the invasion of Ukraine, there was really very little, if not no practical chance that Ukraine would have ever joined NATO, right, due to major security concerns. But I think that the events have changed the situation irrevocably. And we're likely to see neutral countries like Finland and Sweden potentially joining the alliance. And who knows about the fate of the Ukrainian state as it exists now, but their membership, I think the question has changed a lot, dynamic.
What do you think of how NATO and the European Union have responded so far? Are sanctions and military aid for most countries, with the notable exception of Germany, which hasn't provided any military aid, is that enough? I mean, what else should they be doing? Should they be banning Russia from the SWIFT system for international financial transactions, which some people are arguing for? Should they be doing more than what they're doing, or are they doing pretty well?
Well, I don't think we could really say. It's difficult to say they're doing well. I mean, in terms of providing weapons, anecdotally seeing things on social media that apparently the American supplied javelins have proved effective against Russian tanks. But realistically, if the full weight of the Russian army is bearing down on Ukraine, some more guns from Europe, I don't think would have made a substantive difference at all. And Germany's, to be fair, I think Germany takes a lot of flack for not sending in weapons, but Germany has a very distinct historical relationship with Russia and previously this former Soviet Union. Former
and they've provided a lot of money too, right?
Yeah, a lot of money, and Ostpolitik from Willy Brandt kind of defines this wanting to keep a kind of open channel with the Russians engaged, whereas other countries might be a bit more bellicose. In terms of the sanctions today, again, my personal opinion, I thought that they were a little bit weaker than I had expected, although it seems that they're reserving some of the heavier hitting ones for further escalation, although I think that someone asked Biden at the press conference today that if Russia's engaged in a full-scale invasion, what are you waiting for? I tend to agree with that a bit. I think SWIFT is an important thing, but again, SWIFT, is a kind of private company based out of Western Europe, and that a lot of people, at least I've talked to in the financial sphere, say that far more serious damage to Russian banks is cutting off their correspondent accounts with Western and US banks. And the US did cut off correspondent accounts with the major Russian banks, but this has not been applied universally. So there are still levers to exercise in terms of sanctions, but I think it's also fairly clear at this point that sanctions have not served effectively as a deterrence method. So it might need to explore more avenues short of outright military conflict.
Yeah. I want to touch again on something you said earlier about sort of the Russian people. There are many cultural, language, family ties between Russia and Ukraine. How do the Russian people, and admittedly they're not a big monolith, but just generally speaking, how do they view this conflict? Will they be uncomfortable with widespread bloodshed and suffering in Ukraine? And how do you think that they reacted to Ukrainian President Zelensky's speech last night to the Russian people in fluent Russian, making a last-ditch appeal for peace?
Mm-hmm. I think it's an important question, and as Allison mentioned at the beginning, not one that necessarily gets extensive discussion in the Russian press. For many Russians, this is something I've heard in my many years of spending time there, Ukraine is a place that they visited as children, where their grandparents, aunts, uncles, and relatives live. Even with the Maidan revolution and the war in the Donbass, most Russians still retain this kind of, in their mind, a brotherly connection with the Ukrainian people rather than necessarily the government. Although it's increasingly clear in the past several years that this brotherly relationship is very much one-sided. But I think an important distinction needs to be drawn between how the Russian people view this current invasion and the events of 2014, which really saw widespread popular support, even among ostensible liberals, for Russia's annexation of Crimea. Before the annexation took place, the Kremlin spent considerable amount of time honing its propaganda narrative about the Maidan and the need to return, quote unquote, Crimea to its fatherland. And my wife and I lived in Moscow throughout 2013 and 2014 and kind of were firsthand witnesses to these events. And during the entire period leading up to the annexation of Crimea, most of the people I spent time with were liberal-oriented, educated Muscovites who wanted to preserve their jobs and their economic well-being and wanted to avoid a kind of full-scale war at all costs. But they all pretty much admitted that Crimea was a different case, that it was something that wasn't like a war or an annexation, that it really was actually part of Russia, and that this is something kind of different. And perhaps there's some possible legitimacy in that belief. Even Navalny kind of implied that he supported the annexation during his more nationalistic phase. But for this conflict and this invasion right now, there is simply not the popular support for the Kremlin propaganda to justify this invasion. Well, the Kremlin hasn't really even been trying that hard as it was in previous times. There are no counter demonstrations supporting the war effort. There are no heartfelt appeals to Russian brethren. It's only cynical fear and kind of abstract claims about existential threats to Russian survival, and to get onto the question about the speeches, you couldn't have more of a stark contrast between Putin's really dark and fire and brimstone speech about conspiracies and violence and survival, and Zelensky's very short but very personal speech. He is a native Russian speaker. He addressed this in Russian, but he and many other Ukrainians are actually, in fact, native Russian speakers. It's their first language. And particularly when he was talking about saying that the Russians are accusing them of bombing them, but that, bomb where? In Donetsk, where we watched the 2012 Euro Championships and drank with friends when they lost, and Luhansk, where his best friend's mother is buried. I think it was a really heartfelt message that was well received by the people who actually saw it. Anecdotally, on social media, I saw that a Russian reporter said that she was filing for her copy on the day's events in a cafe, and all the waitresses were together watching Zelensky's speech kind of in the back. So I think for the people that did see it, which is not many probably, it was quite powerful. And he's a very powerful figure too. I've said all along that he's, among all of this stuff, by far the most sympathetic figure, and a president that I think Ukrainian people can be quite proud of, no matter what happens.
Excellent. All right. Well, I have about 50 more questions, but we've got some really good audience questions that I have to get to. So I'm going to start doing that. The first one is just sort of, are there places other than Ukraine that Putin believes are properly part of the Russian state? I know you said that the Baltic states were different. How does he feel about Belarus or Moldova, or are there other places that he feels that the relationship is so close as to be almost one nation?
It's a great question. For certain, Belarus and Ukraine are very much at the top of this list, and there have been longstanding rumors that really accelerated after the 2020 events in Belarus against Lukashenko that in the short to near term future, there's going to become some kind of official merger of the two countries into a larger, quote unquote, union structure where they kind of retain autonomous governments, but are really part of the same government. Most Belarusians speak Russian, many is a native language. So those are very much in the imagination of the Russian state. But also there's an interesting case which puts Kazakhstan in a bit of tricky position, but much of the northern part of Kazakhstan was previously associated with the Russian part of the Russian Empire. And there's many ethnic Russians that live in northern Kazakhstan. This is where they tested the atomic bombs. I spent some time living in the Russian city of Chelyabinsk for several months, which is very close to the border of Kazakhstan. And many of my Russian friends and colleagues were actually born in what is now Kazakhstan, but was then the Soviet Union. So it was kind of like crossing state lines, but became a different country. So Kazakhstan is in a precarious position, although I don't think that, that's why in some ways they've stayed close to Putin and to the Russian government. I don't see anything like this happening there, but who knows?
Excellent. Okay. You may have just answered part of this question, but we have another question here that says, how do you see Putin's attitudes toward the predominantly Muslim states in the Caucasus and Central Asia? Would he tend to leave them alone as non-Slavic, or say that he might still try to control them in some way as part of the old Russian Empire?
That's an excellent and very difficult question to unpack, because there's quite a lot there. I would say that in terms of within the modern Russia as it exists today, there are quite a lot of Muslims there. I think it's between 10 and 20% of the total population are Muslims. But there's significant differences between the Caucasus region and then places like Tatarstan, whose capital is Kazan, and Chuvashia, the kind of what would be called Tatars in the Russian language, who have been living kind of peacefully and in alliance with Russians since the time of Ivan the Terrible. When Ivan the Terrible conquered Kazan as a Tatar city, they absorbed the Muslim nobility into the kind of Russian power structures. So it's kind of difficult, I think, for us in the West and Americans to kind of think like this. But in terms of Russians and Tatars, there's never been any kind of real history of ethnic conflict, with the exception of the deportation of Crimean Tatars during the Second World War. But that had to do more with kind of collaboration in Nazi Germany rather than kind of longstanding ethnic animosity. The Caucasus are extremely closely managed by the Russian state, but they're managed by kind of local warlords such as Ramzan Kadyrov. Chechnya is a small region of barely 1 million people, but it's the single largest recipient of money from the Russian federal budget as an administrative region, which mostly goes to corruption and security. So there's quite a lot of time. And Putin mentioned several times in his speech vague ideas that the West had supported. Russia, of course, went to war in Chechnya twice in the 1990s and in early 2000s, that somehow the Western intelligence services had supported the Chechen separatist movement, but also he used it as justification for the invasion of Syria when Russia entered the conflict on behalf of Bashar al-Assad, and the idea that radical Islamist terrorists would filter into Russia via the Caucasus. So much different, complex security question that is very far away from the kind of Russian historical lands that we're talking about right now.
Okay, thank you. Our next question says, you hinted at irrationality as the potential explanation for Putin's move, yet there are signs that a lot of preparations have taken place ahead of this move and expected resulting sanctions. I read somewhere that Russian money denominated exports went from 100% to 10% over the last few years, and that cryptocurrencies could offer the opportunity to overcome any exclusion from traditional international payment systems and bypass it to make money. In addition, the recent meetings with President Xi and the silence of China over the last few hours could lead us to believe that some economic backing could come from exports to China. Do you think this is a possible hypothesis?
Yeah, a lot of parts to that question, but in principle, the broad thrust, yes, I would certainly agree. I mean, the idea of Russia phasing itself out of the dollar-denominated trade world and Western markets has begun since 2014, when the threat of when Russian banks were first sanctioned and the threat of exclusion from the SWIFT system was first brought up as a threat by the United States and NATO and the European Union during that part of the conflict. So very much they've been preparing for that, although I think it's somewhat difficult to say that it was necessarily they were doing that in preparation for what's happening right now exactly. So it's kind of a reorganization of the Russian economy and a kind of what they would call kind of fortress Russia economics. In terms of the preparation, I think that what I meant by irrationality, no, of course, this military buildup has been going on since October. This was clearly extremely well planned out. But again, I don't know the answer to this question, and I'm not sure we'll ever really know. But I'm not convinced that they knew that they were going to do this in October, November, December, because what people like myself and many other experts who believe in the kind of that Putin was acting as a rational actor was that this was all a kind of buildup and preparation to make it look like, it's kind of hard negotiating tactic in order to force concessions from NATO and from the United States. Because of course, Russia is in an economically weaker position than its adversaries. It's more isolated. Its military is the largest in Europe, but certainly couldn't compete with something like the United States. So I think many people, none of this was happening in secret, and the United States intelligence community has been telling us what's going to happen, or what they thought would happen, for the past month and a half. But I think that a lot of people were kind of negligent or didn't think that this was actually going to happen, and this was kind of a strong negotiating tactic. In terms of the relationship with China, this has kind of been building again for a couple of years, really with the ascension of Xi, but also the Crimean events. I would caution to not. I mean, they already have a trading relationship, and I'm sure if Russia is further sanctioned from Western capital markets, that they will naturally turn to China, and I'm sure China would be happy to oblige. China does business with Iran. Not everyone follows U.S. sanctions, but the idea that there's some kind of deep future alliance and relationship between China and Russia, I find to be extremely skeptical, if not alone because of the nature of the political thinking in the Chinese Communist Party. I'm certainly not an expert on this topic, but my understanding is that figures like Xi and they think in terms of decades, if not centuries, in their preparations for building China as a strong power, whereas what we're seeing right now is a very short-term reactionary invasion with totally unforeseen consequences over the next months, let alone years. So I see them as perhaps potential partners in the face of opposition to a US dominated world, but I don't see that going particularly deeper. And Russian people are also, kind of embedded racism and xenophobia, but are not particularly respectful or fond of the Chinese, anecdotally. So that plays a role as well. They think Russians believe themselves to be Europeans at the end of the day.
Okay, our next question says, I get the impression that Putin is much less patient than in former times. Do you agree that he might not wait long before making his next move beyond Ukraine, as he might have done in the past?
I think that I think in terms of impatience, I agree that he is acting more recklessly. Again, I'm not sure, I just don't know enough. I don't really think anybody knows, even the US intelligence services, whether or not there will be a next move after this. I continue to think we'll see a kind of frozen conflict line, the emergence of a new Iron Curtain. But, in terms of the unpredictability and his willingness to shake off any kind of economic consequences or political isolation, yes, it should be concerning. And again, the idea that he's not operating as a rational actor means his impatience and unpredictability is a far bigger concern and far more deadly than in previous times. So yes, this is without a doubt a different phase of his regime.
Speaking this afternoon, Ivo Daalder Obama's first ambassador to NATO, suggested that NATO needs to put 50,000 troops on the ground to prevent Russia creating a land link between Belarus and Kaliningrad. Do you agree?
Again, not a military or NATO expert. I remain somewhat confused about the utility of a land bridge between Kaliningrad and Russia that would involve direct conflict and the triggering of Article 5. I think that NATO will deploy more forces to Eastern Europe, and they'd be right to do so to protect, certainly in the face of this invasion, whether that's in the Baltics, whether that's in Poland, Hungary, which borders Western Ukraine. I think that definitely come. In terms of counts of troop size, it's unclear to me. Russia has the largest ground forces in Europe, but the real kind of, I guess, deterrence of Article 5 is the nuclear option. So I can't say in terms of what I think would be the most effective deployment, but I remain skeptical, even though my skepticism was proved wrong in this case in Ukraine about this land bridge between Kaliningrad and Belarus.
Okay, could this invasion of Ukraine ultimately become the downfall of Putin and his regime? This is likely to become a long, protracted insurgency a la Afghanistan without popular support going in. So could this be the beginning of the end?
Absolutely. Yeah, I really do believe it could be the beginning of the end. But at the same time, what will end Vladimir Putin's rule, other than his natural death, will be domestic pressures, not anything stemming directly from the occupation of Ukraine itself, but the unpopularity of the war and the economic cost imposed on the Russian people. It's unclear, kind of if we take the assumption that many people have put forward, including the US, that the goal here is to install a puppet regime that will be more friendly to Russia, then yeah, I don't see how they could ever. There's not enough soldiers in the Russian army to fully occupy Ukraine, especially the western half of the country. And I agree that there would naturally be underground resistance and that it would be bloody. We're about to find out in the next couple of days as more Russian ground forces enter Ukraine, because I think we've really only seen the beginning of targeted strikes, just exactly what this kind of resistance will look at. But I don't think it would be difficult to imagine terrorist attacks inside the Russian Federation, similar to those that we saw in the IRA in the time of troubles, kind of an escalating of the war coming home. I think it'll be much different. Russians lived through two wars in Chechnya. So the war coming back and Vladimir Putin fundamentally not being able to provide security. He's already given up on the economic benefits, but to not be able to provide security could be trouble. The only way I see Vladimir Putin, I think there's, two ways of him leaving power, and that's through massive demonstrations and the police and military not willing to shoot Russian citizens, which we saw in Belarus was not the case. They were willing to shoot, or a kind of palace coup of elites against him. But in the scenes that we saw on Monday with the Security Council meeting of Putin dressing down and humiliating the spy chief Sergei Naryshkin, who was generally considered the most hawkish of the government, it doesn't seem to me there's a lot of appetite in the Russian elite to force a change. So we will see.
Okay, my next question comes from an English teacher for students in the Sakha Republic.
Yes.
Today I spoke with my Russian students who expressed disbelief and anger with regard to the invasion of Ukraine. One spoke with regret about his aspirations to travel around Europe and study in the United States. Is the US prepared to further sanction ordinary Russians, including preventing them from traveling?
I think this is a very important topic, and I'm really glad that someone raised this question. I feel quite strongly about this topic, so if you'll excuse me, this is not a historian speaking. This is a person, but the suggestion by several EU countries, and it's also been mooted in the United States. Several EU countries have already annulled all visas to Russian citizens. I think this is a disastrous move. This is the exact opposite of what should be being done. I think that the sanctioning of the elites and anyone connected with the criminal regime should continue at full force. But the idea of denying Russians from the Sakha Republic or any kind of place outside, across the country that want to come to Europe or want to come to the United States, one, it's the best form of propaganda because, of course, we have much higher standards of living and relative political freedom. So giving people the chance to see that a different life is possible, and even if they come back, maybe they can create that life there. But also at the same time, that there are a lot of people who are opposed to this regime, who are opposed to the war, who have been political oppositionists, that will be effectively trapped inside the country if they ban visas and ban travel. So if anything, I don't know what Europe and the United States will do. It seems like they're moving towards this general kind of visa restriction. I mean, it's already, right now, it's nearly impossible, even before the conflict, for Russians to get an American visa because of ongoing conflict back and forth between the embassies, and the American embassy staff in Moscow being reduced to a skeleton crew. So I have several friends who have tried to get a Russian visa before all this started, that they first had to get a Schengen visa to go to Germany, and then apply in Germany, fly back to Russia, and then fly to the United States. So it's already been very difficult. But my advice to world leaders would be to accept as many ordinary Russians as possible and give them visas or refugee status, frankly.
Yeah. One of the greatest powers of the United States and the West is the soft power, right? Of cultural exchange and ties. And it would be, seems like shooting yourself in the foot to shut that down.
Totally counterproductive, in my opinion. Absolutely.
Quite a few commentators have drawn the comparison to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where JFK and Khrushchev reached a compromise in which US nuclear missiles were secretly removed from Turkey. Is something like that not possible today? If Russia deployed troops in Mexico, would a US president accept that cheerfully?
That's quite a difficult question to answer. Of course, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they reached a compromise because ultimately Khrushchev backed down,
right,
and kind of saved the world. And so, I think a lot of Americans think that that's a great point of victory, but I would think it's quite sensible to stand down from mutually assured destruction of humanity on the globe. If Russia of course, Russia still has strong relations with Cuba, and Cuba recognized the Donetsk and Lugansk people's republics after they were recognized by Russia. So the historical ties are still there. If Russia deployed troops to Mexico, I'm sure the United States wouldn't accept that, but it seems like a pretty far-fetched scenario to me. And it's also, the current state of Russia does not quite have the global or revolutionary ambitions that the Soviet Union did. And, the Soviet Union spent an awful lot of time and money in the developing world trying to sell its brand of communism, its particularly brand of development, whereas the only thing that Russia is selling to particularly countries in Africa is mercenary services and authoritarian repression. So the goals are quite different. I think that the Cuban Missile, I think this is perhaps more in common with the Berlin airlift crisis of the early 1950s, just in the sense that even though Putin has made reference to nuclear weapons, we're not quite yet at a nuclear stage conflict. And that is something that is qualitatively and substantively different than what's happening in Ukraine, and would be far scarier to the globe if it escalated to that level, in my opinion.
Okay. The next question is about Beijing watching this whole situation very closely. And do you think how the West responds to Russia will inform China's decision-making with regard to Taiwan?
I should say that I am certainly in no way a China expert, and I'm sure there are many other members of the World Affairs Council of Maine that can speak far more eloquently and more informed than I can about China. I think absolutely, though, from my perspective, that China is very much closely watching how this plays out, how Russia is punished, what kind of response there will be. In terms of the situation of Taiwan, whether the invasion of Ukraine makes the invasion of Taiwan more likely or less likely, I'm not able to say. The one thing I guess maybe I've been perhaps a little bit naively optimistic in the past, but I don't think that this conflict in Ukraine will go well for Putin. And I agree with the earlier question that, there's the chance that this could lead to the end of the regime. And I think at the end of all of this, Russia will pay such a high price that I don't know if the Chinese will be willing to pay the same cost for this, although at the same time, they're not facing, Taiwan's not in Europe, it's an island that's quite far away. So the security concerns there are much different. But dealing with the Chinese and kind of their their approach to their what they perceive to be their sphere of influence and kind of the historical role of the Chinese Communist Party is much different than dealing with Putin. So I'm not sure how much can be drawn from that, but for sure China is watching to see how this plays out. I think there's no doubt about that.
Yeah. The next question comes from another teacher who says, some 5 million Russians have migrated out of Russia since Putin came to power. Many of my own students expressed interest in immigrating to the West. Do you see brain drain, the concept that intellectuals who leave a country remove their own potential of improving the country? Do you see that as something that is happening?
Yeah, and it's as the question mentioned, it's been happening for quite a while. I mean, you have to only go as far as look at Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and many of the top programmers and mathematicians and computer scientists are all from Russia. Many of whom, in the late '90s, early 2000s, were trained at Soviet universities and came over and created incredible achievements and products in the United States. Yeah, and this is something that Russia has been facing. I wouldn't say since Putin took power, but since the fall of the Soviet Union, really. I mean, I think that, not that that's the point of this conversation, but the 1990s in Russia were one of the most difficult, economically depressed, violent, depressing times. And that's really kind of one of the strengths that Putin has kind of used throughout his regime, although it's been increasingly less effective as there's more younger people in a population that grew up under his rule, but that he would never let Russia turn back into the 1990s again. So the brain drain problem, also the capital flight problem, money leaving Russia, this is a long kind of historical roots, and I expect that it would increase considerably if people are actually allowed to leave. And this has happened in Belarus. Before 2020 events in Belarus, Belarus had developed an incredible IT sector, homegrown kind of computer scientists and IT, and after the repressions, the sector basically ceased to exist, and most of these people fled to Europe and to the United States. So I guess for their sake, I hope that Russians who would like to leave will have the opportunity to.
Okay. Well, it's after 8, so I have one final question for you, and that is, I know it is speculative, but what do you think Russians are thinking about the United States and the West in light of what is transpiring in Ukraine and our subsequent actions? How are they viewing us?
And this has come up. I've for the past week, but especially in the past 2 days, I've had a lot of fraught phone calls with Russian friends. Even before this conflict, I would say that my experience, I've been going, the first time I went to Russia was 2007, when kind of ties were friendly. In 2014, of course, things got a lot worse, but almost my entire time that I've been there, Russian people are very friendly towards Americans. People would always tell me, what you would hear is that I love Americans, I just don't like your government all the time. But they very clearly, and I think that's the nature of living in an authoritarian system where government is not representative of people, but they very much see the government and the people as two completely separate entities that almost have nothing to do with each other. Whereas here in the United States, a lot of people kind of project that like Russia is Putin, Putin is Russia, the people are the same, that they're all kind of one entity that's the same thing. And this is very much not the case. And so Russians always think that, they certainly did not like Barack Obama. A lot of that was driven by racism. A lot of that was driven by him taking a strong line with Vladimir Putin. But I personally never experienced, well, maybe once or twice, some kind of harsh personal anti-Americanism. But right now, I just returned from Uzbekistan earlier in this week. I spent 2 weeks in Uzbekistan. There's a lot of ethnic Russians there, and a lot of them were kind of pointing to the war in Iraq, the United States' history of bombing different countries. And this was before Russia invaded, so they said that it's faulty intelligence. Or the United States is goading Russia into an invasion and all this stuff. And I would kind of tell them that, well, Russia has already invaded Ukraine. It's already happened in 2014. Well, why does the conflict in eastern Ukraine exist? It exists because Russian soldiers supported Ukrainian Russian-backed separatists. So, but I think that, if you look at polls from state-run media, they'll say that most people think that NATO is to blame for escalating the situation. But I think that many people, especially those who are not kind of older rural residents of Russia who only watch state TV, they're aware that with this full scale invasion of Ukraine, that this is very much Russia's doing. But I don't think that they have any particular hope that the United States is going to save them or is going to end the conflict. I think they just are expecting and hunkering down for an extended frozen conflict, but really just trying to survive the next couple of days or weeks, because who knows what's going to happen in that time period. Of course, notwithstanding, and many of them will mention that they know that Ukrainians are facing a much worse future than they are.
Well, absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Dakota. This has just been incredible, and I really could talk about this for another hour, but if I do, Allison will kill me. So thank you so much, and I'll toss it back to you, Allison.
Thank you.
Andrea, I would not kill you, because I could also listen to this for an hour, and, like any good, informative discussion, I'm leaving with more questions than I began. And I just, sincerely want to thank you, Dakota. I know what it's like to be in the United States, watching a region or a country that you care about, that you've invested so much of your life in, to sort of go in this direction. And I really appreciate you coming tonight and giving us this opportunity to really sort of look at this conflict from the perspective of the Russian people, to give us some insight into what's possibly going on inside of Putin's head. Very scary place indeed. But also that long-term perspective in terms of, whatever happens and whatever pundits got wrong, I think we didn't want to believe this was going to happen, right? I mean, sometimes the intelligence is there and it's so unimaginable that 2 + 2 could equal 4 that you want it to be 5, right?
Yes.
But I think regardless, you've made very clear that, the long term for this is not good for Russia or for Putin. And so may you live in interesting times. So thank you both. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, audience. I am sorry we did not get to all of your excellent questions. I hope this webinar tonight has given you a picture of the wealth of expertise and interesting people that are in the World Affairs Council of Maine. And of course, I would be remiss. I want to once again thank our wonderful sponsors, who have made these programs possible and have also offered us to, offer this free to Maine students, free to our members, and at a reduced price to the general public. We are tentatively planning a second webinar on the crisis in Ukraine for March 9th. We will hopefully have some NATO experts, so stay tuned for that. And on March 16th, we'll be changing gears completely, but also into another new world. We're going to be having a webinar on non-fungible tokens, NFTs, and the global arts trade. So thank you, everyone. And I hope we all get some rest and take a little break from the news, Dakota. Good evening.
Yes.
This is the end of the webinar.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Good night.